Spotlight.
This is Akashvani. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on National Space Day 2026, Advancing India's Space Ecosystem. The participants are Pallav Bagla, Senior Science Journalist, and Sarabjit Kaur, Anchor.
India is celebrating its third National Space Day. This day gives us an opportunity not only to celebrate India's achievements in space, but also to reflect on the new possibilities that lie ahead. To understand this in detail, we are fortunate to connect with Mr. Pallav Bagla, science communicator. Mr. Pallav, welcome to the discussion.
Namaskar.
Mr. Pallav, we understand that the National Space Day is observed in memory of the achievement of soft landing made by the Vikram lander of Chandrayaan-3 on the lunar South Pole at Shiv Shakti Point. So let's start our discussion from this point itself, and if you could please, for the benefit of our listeners, let us know everything about this historic milestone in little more detail.
India's Vikram lander successfully landed closer to the south pole of the moon in 2023 and created history because India became the first country in the world to land nearer the south pole of the moon. And then we put out a rover which went around the south pole of the moon, and later Prime Minister named the spot where Vikram landed as Shiv Shakti. And to celebrate that golden moment, India celebrates August 23rd as the National Space Day. And today the National Space Day is being celebrated at Ahmedabad, and many things have been announced there.
We'll first like to dwell on the fact that just ahead of the National Space Day, Prime Minister Narendra Modi interacted with CEOs from 20 space startups, urging them to build an ecosystem strong enough to pull top global talent to India while reassuring investors of consistent government support. We'd like to have your expert comment on this.
The Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been a constant supporter of the space endeavors. Even when he was the Chief Minister of Gujarat, it was his habit to hold his cabinet meetings in the remote sensing center at Gandhinagar. So his love for space has continued, and he has shown even more affection for space when he gave a call for reforms in the space sector. So I was not surprised that just prior to the National Space Day, he met with 20 CEOs of various startup companies which are doing good work in the sector of space. Today, India has 400 plus startups in the space sector, of which the government chose 20 of them to come and showcase their work to Prime Minister Narendra Modi, which included Skyroot Aerospace and Agnikul and Pixel, some of the more advanced startups. And this is a sure way of not just patting the Indian startups on their back, but also telling them that the highest office in the country is behind you. The policies of the country will back you. Go look for money, go explore whatever is required, and do the best. And some of the startups are really doing exactly that.
Mr. Pallav, this indeed sets the stage of self-sufficiency. So how do you read this year's National Space Day's theme towards Vikasit Bharat, innovating, collaborating and aspiring global space leadership?
Well, we have had end-to-end capabilities in space. India makes its own rockets, makes its own satellites, and more than that, in the application sector, we are second to none. A lot of that was actually spurred in the government sector by the Indian Space Research Organization. But after the reforms were brought in, many space startups came into the picture and they have increasingly been doing well. We cannot depend on foreign technology to be delivering for India's development in a vital strategic sector like space. That is why you need both the private sector and the government sector to work together to make sure that citizens are benefited to the maximum and their lives are enabled and makes life easier for people.
Mr. Pallav, so how important is the growing trust between the government and the private sector? And can policy continuity and an environment that encourages risk-taking give further momentum to India's space ecosystem?
Right now, the Indian startups are in very nascent stages. They need a lot of handholding if they have to succeed. But even when we are looking at a purely government-controlled space sector with Department of Space and ISRO, even at that stage, 80% of the money or technology was coming from the private space sector. 400 plus industries contribute to India's rockets and satellites in one form or the other. So now when the private sector, especially startups, are coming up, they are using the same industrial ecosystem, but in a different way, and they are getting trusted sources as suppliers, which is why we saw Skyroot Aerospace being able to succeed in its maiden launch and put the Vikram 1 rocket into orbit in such a, what seems like a very simple operation, but it was a very complex business which had gone behind it. So there is indeed on one side the government helping, which is the Space Research Organization ISRO, the private sector, and also the government through its policies. But what we need is having an enabling space law and liability regime of which work is going on, but we need to get that passed and make sure that we have an ecosystem which is held together through a legally binding mechanism. That would be one need of the hour, and let's see when that happens, which is to get a space law in place.
Mr. Pallav, as you rightly said, though in the nascent stage, how significant is the growing participation of private companies and startups in India's space sector? And in fact, in the recent years, the private sector has moved beyond launches and satellites to develop capabilities in several new areas. What's your expert comment on this?
Certainly. See, like I said, the private sector has participated in the ISRO program from the very beginning. But when you look at the fully private sector, which is the likes of Skyroot Aerospace from Hyderabad and Agnikul and Pixel and SatSure, they have done very well, and they are going to be making, like Skyroot Aerospace launched their first rocket. We'll see Agnikul Cosmos coming to the launch pad sometime early next year to have their first orbital launch. In satellites, I think there are several companies which have done quite well. Pixel Aerospace already has a half a dozen satellites in orbit. Galaxy tried on their satellite and they failed, but that's not too bad because space is an unforgiving technology and not everything succeeds in the first attempt. On the application side, I am seeing a lot of things happening, especially startup like SatSure, which is contributing to the insurance sector, the farmers' insurance sector. We have Digantara, another startup which is contributing to the space situational awareness program. And there are also companies which are catering to our defense needs. So there's plenty happening. And if we continue talking, I can go on for next 2 hours talking about how different companies are doing incredibly new things for the country. And all of this happening because there is very able support for India and its space ecosystem by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who's personally pushing to make sure that India succeeds well in space technology.
Mr. Pallav, we have the demographic dividend of being the most populous country. So in the backdrop of this, is our education system gearing up to take up the challenges which this new domain is throwing out, that is the space?
The Indian Institute of Space Technology, which is part of the Indian space research ecosystem from Thiruvananthapuram, which is producing aerospace engineers. We need to do a lot more. If our startups have to grow in a big way, then they need trained manpower and human power. And some of the places, incredibly, it's women who are leading the charge. So we need a lot of support in the education system. IITs are starting off new programs in aerospace engineering. Indian Institute of Science has an old program on aerospace engineering, and we will see a lot more requirement of Indian, not just entrepreneurs, but trained engineers and scientists contributing to that. And the education system really needs to look forward how it will be able to cater to the new developing horizon, which is very large canvas in front of us.
So you just spoke about the Gen Z taking that thought process forward. India's space sector is now becoming not only a domain of scientific achievement, but also an area of investment, employment, exports, global business. So Mr. Pallav, we'd like to know from you, how do you view the international opportunities and government support being extended to Indian space companies in the context of India's emerging space economy?
Well, as far as the ISRO ecosystem goes, we have seen several foreign companies coming and launching from ISRO, and last year we saw 2025 ending with a American private sector company launching a heavyweight satellite, a 6-tonner satellite using our Bahubali rocket or the launch vehicle Mark III from Sriharikota, and ISRO did very well on that. Will our startups become global companies? Is any of our private startups capable of taking on Elon Musk and SpaceX? I think the first baby steps have been taken, but space is very risky business. It is very unforgiving. It consumes money by hordes, and if you succeed, you succeed, but there are plenty of failures strewn all over. So we'll have to wait and watch whether any of these companies become global forces to reckon with. But yes, the ISRO's ecosystem is already attracting attention from the world, and as and when there is spare capacity available from ISRO, they make their rockets available to private companies to launch, like we saw for the OneWeb satellites or we saw for the Bluebird satellite. But that's still few and far between because our national requirements are very large.
To wind up today's discussion, Mr. Pallav, we'll like to know from you that finally, looking beyond National Space Day 2026, in your view, what are the areas India should focus on most to take its space capabilities to the next level, to be a part of globally competitive space ecosystem?
India has a very clear roadmap in front of us. Prime Minister Narendra Modi laid out a very clear roadmap going up to 2047 literally for the Indian Space Research Organization, and already allocated 33,000 crore rupees, and the plan is to send on an Indian rocket to space from Sriharikota on the Gaganyaan program, initially a Gaganyatri, and then to have by 2035 the Bharatiya Antariksh Station or the Indian Space Station. Today only China is the only country which has its own independent space station. So India would join in a league which is very unique. And then the roadmap includes sending an Indian to the moon and bringing an Indian safely back to Earth. So the roadmap is quite clear, of which a lot of activities for R&D part will happen at the Indian Space Research Organization. And some of the repeat capabilities will go to the private sector because they are probably more keen on doing that. So we will see the ecosystem growing much larger. There's a new spaceport being made at Tamil Nadu, and the chairman of the promoter and regulator of space, Dr. Pawan Goenka, recently told me that the Tamil Nadu spaceport will be handed over to the private sector for its operations. So we are seeing a lot of activity in space, but our lives should become easier, and that is what should be the motto of any space activity. I see a very bright future for India's space ecosystem, but a lot of that is being enabled thanks to the visionary leadership of our Prime Minister, Shri Narendra Modi, who leads the charge on space from the front.
Mr. Pallav Bagla, thank you very much for sparing your valuable time and sharing such insightful thoughts with us.
Always a pleasure speaking to Akashvani.
You were listening to a discussion on National Space Day 2026, Advancing India's Space Ecosystem. The participants were Pallav Bagla, Senior Science Journalist, and Sarabjit Kaur, Anchor. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official.
Spotlight.